Hello and welcome to the weekly voice chat for Men Are Human. We are the semi-official Discord of the men's rights subreddit. Today's topic, if you want to go to the voice discussion section, I just posted a Reddit post. And this was an open letter to the MensLib subreddit following an AMA they had with a member from the Duluth Model organization. And a lot of men's libbers were very upset and very surprised that the Duluth Model guy was very much hesitant to recognize male victims of domestic violence and was very hesitant to recognize the fact that domestic violence can go both ways. And our open letter to them basically said, listen, we understand you guys mean well. We know a lot of male feminists are coming from a good place, and a lot of female feminists too. But you have to understand there are some very toxic portions of the feminist movement today. And a lot of the feminist theory and a lot of the feminist organizations don't actually practice what they preach. And the Duluth model is an example of that. So we invited a member of, actually a moderator from the MensLib and Against Hate subreddits subreddit. His name is Worse Than Hipster. And again, he is working, so I'm not sure he can be here now, but he's certainly going to listen after the fact. And a lot of men's libbers are going to be listening to this after the fact, so everyone please be polite. But that's kind of what we're talking about today. We're talking about MensLib, the subreddit, and how a lot of men feel frustrated by feminism. And a lot of male feminists feel frustrated. All the time I see posts saying things like, in the MensLib subreddit, saying things like, oh, I feel ashamed to be male. I feel guilty for being male, which is such an unhealthy mindset. So that is the topic, and let's get it going. Ma, do you have anything to say or anything to add?
Well, to be honest, I think you really undersold how apocalyptic that AMA was for the male abuse victims in the sub. If you read through it, the story you get is basically somebody asks a question, and this Chuck guy swoops in, bombs the hell out of it with basically saying that male abuse victims are actually lying and they are telling people, like they're trying to get away with abusing women. So if a man says he's being abused by a woman, it's actual evidence that he's abusing the woman. So it's a Kafkaesque system, like quite literally. At least what Chuck Derry is saying is that if a guy, speaks up in, if he doesn't speak up, he's an abuser. If he does speak up, he's even more of an abuser, and he's admitted it, and he's trying to manipulate the system. And then abuse victims would come in and they would say that they were horrified by this. They would say that they didn't know what was going on. They would, like, a bunch of them broke down in the chat and were just almost like you could hear them crying behind the screen almost. And
that's
then Chuck would totally ignore them.
Yeah, and sorry to cut you off, but that's kind of the message that we've been trying to get out to MensLib for a long time. We promise you, we are not the bad guys. And the idea that we're just secretly misogynistic is just not true. I mean, we do genuinely care about men's issues, and we do genuinely care about men's rights. And the reason why we're anti-feminist, we're not against the idea of feminism. And we say this almost every week in these chats, it seems. But what we are against, we're not against the principle of feminism as a concept, but we are against some specific actions from some specific feminist groups. And the Duluth model is a very influential feminist group, and they're doing damage. They're doing harm. And so, yeah, we're going to call it out.
The thing that really gets me is that even in that thread and in the thread, like the aftermath thread that they had on there, the mods were deleting comments from anyone saying that the Duluth model comes from feminism directly. And it's built out of patriarchy theory and all that other stuff. And they were refusing to acknowledge the link there, and they're refusing to acknowledge the fact that there has to be some sort of criticism of this before anyone can move forward. Because it's just like I really feel sorry for them having to live in this environment where they just can't speak out about the real problem. To me, I've always said it's managed opposition. Like they're not allowed to speak out, but they're given a space where they're told they can.
Right, and I just want to say, sorry, Willie. I just want to say again, Worse Than Hipster has joined our server. He can't be here right now because he's working, but he will be listening to this. He is a moderator of both MensLib and Against Hate Subs, and both of those are considered pretty anti-MRA. But we had a very, very positive conversation last night where he came in and we did some debating, but we found a lot of common grounds. And I respect him. I really enjoyed talking to him. He seems like a very decent person, a very intelligent person. He seems a very genuine person. And so I think we made a lot of progress in kind of bridging our two communities. And that's something that I wanted to do, we've wanted to do for a very long time. And I feel that went very, very well. So when you do listen to this, Worse Than Hipster, again, thank you so much for coming. You're always welcome here. We had a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, so, again, what I would tell you and the rest of your mods and both of your subreddits is, yes, there are toxic elements to the men's rights movement. But here, what we stand for is just equality for all, decent behavior, respectful behavior, being civil. That's kind of what we're all about. And so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what MRAs actually believe and, who we actually are. But kind of sucks that you have work right now. I understand work is work. I mean, I'm only doing this now because I'm on lunch break. So I'm going to have to leave early. It's kind of how the real world works. But yeah, so I think we've definitely made some good progress. But to what Moss said, I do feel sorry for a lot of male feminists who are very much trapped in this very confusing mentality where they're told seemingly paradoxical things or mutually exclusive things. So I can only imagine how challenging that must be.
Okay, first I'd just like to say that, before this, I was pretty active on r/MensLib, and in the MensLib community, I was very supportive of them, and I still am supportive of them. I might not agree with them on all of their theories, but I'm just supportive of them as people and of their goals, right? So please, if you're a MensLib person listening to this, I have no enmity with you or anything like that. So please just give me a piece of your mind. Now, if we look at the things that Chuck Derry was saying, I disagree with him. I'm really happy that he's willing to help, female victims of domestic violence. I disagree with what he said about male victims of domestic violence. But if we are to properly look at the theory, for example, that patriarchy is the main cause of domestic violence against women, and that domestic violence against men is, less prevalent, and that male victims, or rather men, they're the advantaged ones and everything like that. I'm just going to very quickly read you something that was written by this lady called Katie Trastrom Fenton, who was talking about making domestic violence shelters for male victims, right? So she said in her article, Unpopular Opinion, men's domestic violence shelters are a misuse of nonprofit funding, right? So then she talks about how, it's good that male victims of domestic violence are coming forward, but at the end of the day, it's still better to help women because, if you help men, you're not helping women at the same time, and that kind of thing, right? And then she begins to kind of, kind of disagree with MRAs. For example, she says here, domestic violence is one enactment of patriarchy where someone, most often a woman, is robbed of her personhood and treated like possession of her, most often male abuser. We live in a culture where boys are advertised to by telling them a product will get girls, where objectification of women in advertising is still rampant. Right? So she talks about how patriarchy is one of the main things that causes domestic violence, right? And yeah, so here she says, I am personally wary of domestic violence shelters for men because one of men's rights activists' rallying cries is, why aren't there domestic violence shelters for men? They ask this without ever acknowledging that the whole reason that interpersonal violence is even seen as problematic in the first place is because of feminism, right? So let me just quickly post the archive of this, because this was on Exojane, and Exojane is no longer it doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what happened to it. I think it got shut down. I don't know why. But yeah, I've posted it on voice discussion, right? So if we look at what she says here, that it's only seen as problematic in the first place is because of feminism. Domestic violence, at least in the US and the UK, has been seen as problematic since as far back as the 1600s, right? So men who beat their wives, they could be beaten up by people in the communities around them. They could be publicly whipped. They could be strapped to a donkey and have ride the donkey backwards. It's called riding skimmingtons, right? So it's been a thing for a really long time to punish male perpetrators of domestic violence, right? Since a very, very long time, that's been the case. It's not something that only happened because of the feminist movement, right? So I'll give you an example. Um, in a study done by, one second, let me get this person's name, um, Elizabeth Katz. She gives one example here, right? And this is in the very early 1900s. She says, she was talking about a specific case of when a wife came forward to complain about her husband beating her, and this is what happened. A fine or imprisonment will do such a brute as you no good, exclaimed Elderman B.A. McKelvey. Sorry, I don't really know that much about American names. To defendant Louis Sambolia, after hearing evidence against him in Hazleton, Pennsylvania court in 1907. I am going to give you the punishment you deserve. The infuriated judge seized Sambolia by the collar, dragged him outside the courthouse, stripped the clothing from his back, and handcuffed him to a post. Using a belt quickly provided by a bystander, the young and strong McKelvey vigorously flogged Sambolia until he fell to his knees and cried for mercy. Sambolia's victim stood with evident satisfaction as the crowd applauded the judge's speedy approach to justice. The crime that prompted the judge to take justice into his own hands, wife beating, right? So this whole paper talks about how violence against women or violence against wives was also seen as problematic prior to the 1970s, right? So it's no perspective. It's not Elizabeth Katz. It's Katz with a Z and a K. So it's always been seen in many communities as improper to beat women. That's just a fact, right? And now if we look at the present day, the present day situation of domestic violence, Murray Strauss, he has a paper here that talks about domestic violence, and he found that by the 2000s there were over 140 studies shown similar rates of domestic violence between men and women, right? And then he says this in the report. A central feature of the feminist theory is that PV occurs because men use violence to maintain dominance in their marital relationship. This is certainly true. What it ignores is that it is only one of many risk factors for PV, and that women as well as men use violence to dominate. Figure 2 presents the results of a study of 854 students at two American universities. It shows that dominance by either partner is associated with an increased probability of PV. So actually what he's pretty much saying here is that there is some truth to the fact that some men might use physical violence to dominate in a relationship, but that's actually one of the many, many reasons that PV actually occurs. And women are just as likely to use violence to control within a relationship. So, whenever you have a study, whenever you want to test for something, this is just common things that you learn in university in your research methods class, right? You have to have a control group and you have to have an experimental group. If the results of the control group and the experimental group are the same, then you cannot say that the treatment is what's bringing up the new results, right? So if men and women both use violence within a relationship to control one another at similar rates, then you cannot argue that domestic violence is a result of men being encouraged to perpetrate violence against women and control women, right? That's just something that not happen. That doesn't happen, right? In another study, right? In another study, they were again trying to test for the male control in a relationship theory, right? And they had this to say. The aim of the current study was to test several predictions derived from contrasting approaches to understanding IPV. The male control theory of IPV, derived separately from feminist and evolutionary theory, predicts that there would be sex differences in IPV and the use of control tactics within the relationship. According to feminist researchers, and then they give the amount of feminist researchers there, IPV is mostly perpetrated by men who use their aggression to maintain power and control within the family structure. Male power is rooted in patriarchal societal structure, which tolerates the use of violence against women as a tool for control. This view of IPV holds that it has a specific epidemiology and should be studied separately from aggression in other contexts. An influential evolutionary view of IPV has similar predictions, but differs in ultimate source of male control. In this case, the male proprietary mindset is deemed to have arisen from the maladaptive consequences of raising another man's offspring. So they just did a quick overview of what are common views of domestic violence. That's caused by patriarchy. That is caused by men being naturally more aggressive, right? And then this is where they discuss the results of the study. They say the findings from the present study did not support the male control view of IPV in the following ways. First, we found in as many previous studies using unselected samples that men were not more physically aggressive to their partners than women were. Indeed, we found the opposite, that women reported being more physically and verbally aggressive to their partners than men were. We also found, again consistent with many previous studies, that in the same sample, men reported more physical aggression to same-sex non-intimates than women did. Thus, we added to a small number of studies that have demonstrated these contrasting patterns within the same sample, right? Again, I will post that study. So what this essentially says is that, patriarchy is not the big bad in domestic violence. It's not only men committing violence against women. It's women also sometimes committing violence against men, if you want to look at the full picture of domestic violence. So it's not okay to say that patriarchy is the biggest or the main reason for domestic violence, right? And then here we have, I promise this is the last one, a book written by Richard B. Felson, and I've talked about him before. He's a researcher that does a lot of research into violence and gender specifically. And if you look through a lot of his research, you'll find that many different studies have found that people actually have more compassion for female victims of domestic violence than they do have for male ones, that they view hitting women as worse than hitting men, that they view women hitting men as not as bad as men hitting women or men hitting other men, right? And then he even had a study called the normative protection of women, right? And he actually disagrees with the theory that the reason why women are more protected than men is because of women's fertility, because even elderly women are protected much more than men, right? So he wrote a whole book about this. It's called Violence and Gender Reexamined. And from the overview, it says, using a comparative method to determine how violence against women differs from violence against men, Felsen illustrates not only that violence against women is less frequent than violence against men, but also that our culture and legal system treat it more harshly. Contrary to the claims that our courts blame the victim in cases of violence against women, the author shows that the tradition of protection of women sometimes produces the opposite effect, and that it is due process and not sexism that makes, for instance, rape cases seem biased against women. This powerful book encourages all readers, be they psychologists, lawyers, social scientists, or concerned lay people, to question preconceptions about gender and violence. Okay, so the main focus of what we're discussing here is not rape, but violence against women, right? So you can see in the book that if anything, sexism actually decreases violence against women, because how many men do you know say that they would never hit a woman? So many men. I know so many men like that, right? But finally, the common patriarchal, another part of patriarchal theory is that the reason why male victims of domestic violence are deemed as unimportant is because apparently they say that under patriarchy women are viewed as inferior and intellectually disabled or whatever, and that means that they can't possibly be capable of violence. Now I disagree with this, right? And I'm going to give you a reason. If you look at Umberto Eco's list for identifying a fascist, you'll see that one of the things he or she states is that the enemy will seem both both stronger and weaker than the opposition, right? So it wouldn't make much sense if, let's say, for example, we did live in a patriarchal, misogynist, evil world, women would be viewed as evil and violent, even if we weren't, and it was men who would be viewed as, the sweet and harmless ones, But the fact that it's actually the opposite, that women are viewed as the sweet and harmless ones, and that men are viewed as the violent ones, it actually goes against this patriarchal, misogynistic theory, right? And the fact that we have much more resources for female victims of domestic violence than male victims of domestic violence, and that female domestic violence victims and all of these organizations that deal with them are supported by the government, are supported by things like the UN, it actually shows that women and female victims have a lot of influence, right? Not, I wouldn't maybe say power, but influence. And the people who run these organizations, they do have a lot of power. It wouldn't make sense for them to try to portray themselves as these people who are going against the grain, fighting against the patriarchal world order that is determined to oppress women, when it's those governments and even sometimes the men in power themselves who are supporting these people. No one is against these shelters and these organizations that deals with them. No one is against them. Absolutely no one. Not the big corporations, not the governments, not anything. No one supports the male abusers. No one does. So again, this goes against this patriarchal theory and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
I
Thank
would
you,
just
Kate.
like
That was
to,
very well researched.
I would,
Julie, did you want to say something?
yeah, I would just like to say that I do agree with everything, and that's correct. I would just like to add that there might be some people who actually think that that male abusing female is okay, but they tend to just be hardcore Islamists, and not even all of them think that. But just like as a side note, that was important to mention.
Well, I just wanted to touch on Kate's argument because I feel that a lot of her points kind of ignore the elephant in the room of the physical disparity that is between men and women. And like, I think that everything that she says kind of works on the baseline that men and women are inherently physically equal, and everything we know about like anatomy and physiology proves contrary. Like we see this with top celebrity athletes in female sports being beaten in a simple pickup basketball game by high school boys, because men and women aren't physically equal and aren't physically capable. So a lot of the outrage and a lot of where I feel this sympathy towards women comes from is in the fact that if there is a one-on-one fight between a man and a woman will typically lose in all cases. And even in the biggest, media outrage case now, with the girl who went missing when she was with her fiance and no one can find her. We know from when the police pulled them over the first time, she had already admitted to hitting him, and he already was witnessed by someone who called the police hitting her as well. So we know that they fight each other, but only one of them is missing. Why? Because men and women aren't physically equal to each other. So them going head to head in a fight isn't going to have the same exact result. Now, that doesn't make it okay. And that's where I do agree with your points. Like, there should be resources for male victims of violence. And I do think that a lot of the times, because of the way that men are socialized and conditioned about violence towards women, they won't defend themselves even when it is like necessary. And if they do defend themselves, sometimes they will fall victim to the law. So I understand that and I agree with that element of it. But you can't ignore that there's a physical discrepancy. Just like when I was working in schools with troubled children, they were very violent towards me. They hit me, they kicked me, they bit me, they did all of these things. But if I were to haul off and
So
pop them,
sorry.
people would look at me crazy because I'm the adult in the situation and I'm physically more capable than they are.
The
Thank you
strength
for
point
that input.
The strength point is something we do have to take into consideration. But what we also have to take into consideration is that women tend to abuse men emotionally and physically to the point where they turn around and they have, they are provoked to the point where they can only get back to get out of the situation. Because what they'll do, female abusers will often do, is back the man into a corner, use the fact that he is genetically programmed and socially programmed, and he has this huge axe over his head from the police saying that he shouldn't hit a woman ever, ever, ever. And she will back him into a corner and she will use that to abuse him and hit him, and she will use weapons. She will attack him with weapons and things like that. And she will do it to provoke him into hitting her. And then she will
But
call the police, and the police will come and beat him up. That's a
right,
typical
but
tactic.
even in the
Hold on.
case which
And it does get to the point where you will. I mean, this scenario with this man who killed this woman, presuming it was him because the courts haven't decided yet, this is actually something which really kind of plays into our theory of domestic violence, which says that a lot of abuse, like a lot of women who wind up dead in relationships, are dead because they are the abusers and they pushed the man so far that he lashed out, and with overwhelming strength he killed her. And it may or may not have been an accident. We're not. It's not our. It's not us to decide that. But that's the sort of thing which perpetuates this gap between men and women in the death statistics. At least in our opinion, we think that uh, it can be the case that since men have absolutely nowhere to run, they're pushed to the point where they do overboard. And I am not saying at all that they're justified in doing that. That's not what I'm saying here. And Kaiser is right that this is something that's going to offend a lot of people. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of statistics saying that the murder rate between men and women used to be a lot more similar. And then after women started getting shelters they could escape to, it changed. But the only place men really have to escape to is the streets. That's about it, really. Now, people, please feel free to contradict me and try to debate me on this.
Well, what I
If you
was
want.
saying is essentially none of anything that you just stated goes contrary to anything that I said. As I said in my initial reply to what Kate was arguing, that I do agree that there are discrepancies, and I already pointed out about how men get pushed to certain points, and when they do respond, there's not a lot of resources or sympathy or understanding on their behalf, which I've stated. So everything of what you said was essentially elaborating on a point I had already made, but nothing that you said has anything to do with my point, which was the reason that people sympathize and empathize, and the reason that a lot of people have more sympathy towards females or view it in a certain way is because of the physical discrepancy, which I felt was being ignored. That's all I said. I didn't say anything to contradict what you were saying, and I didn't say that any of those things are correct. I'm just saying that
Okay.
we know that one-on-one, men and women are not equal physically.
Well,
Okay, I understand what you're saying. Can I try responding first, please?
Go on.
It's okay. Yeah, so I understand what you're saying, and of course I'm not ignoring it. Yes, there is a physical disadvantage on the woman's part, unfortunately. Um, However, you know what I would think is that while there is that element, of course, people having more concern for the woman, you know, people being like if a man hit a woman, even lightly, people would be like, oh my god, is she okay? You know, that he was just being an asshole. But like if a woman hit a guy really hard, you know, no one would care. I mean, like, he's fine, you know, he's a grown man and things like that. Yeah, so people having like a bigger empathy for, you know, women, and you know, it's just a general thing. And like, you know, it wouldn't really, you know, okay, let's say for example you have a male abuser and you have a female victim, right? She'll get a lot of sympathy, right? um but now if you have the opposite, if you have a female abuser and a male victim, right? People will have a really bad, like throughout history and even today, people have just been humiliating, you know, male victims of domestic violence. You know, in the past, you know, like throughout the 17th and the 18th and the 19th century, they used to do this thing where they would publicly humiliate him by putting him on like a donkey and making him ride it backwards. That was completely unnecessary. I mean, there's one thing to have less empathy for a male victim of domestic violence, and then it's another thing to just completely humiliate him, which is horrific, right? But you know, that's kind of what we see in today's, you know, society, that, you know, if let's say for example a guy, like I'll give you that example of what's his name. I think his name was Paul Jenner. His girlfriend like beat him to the like several times, beat him to the point of injury, and during the last time she beat him so much that he went into a coma, and he was taken to hospital, and she was arrested, and he died like a few days later. Now, this particular case was on TV, right? So everyone knew about it, right? And she only got, I think, 3 to 5 months in prison because the judge said it cannot be proven that, you know, him dying was linked to her beating him, despite the fact that she literally put him in the hospital, right? So of course there might be, and of course there is, you know, a physical discrepancy between men and women. However, even during the situations when women severely injure men, they still get, you know, a much lesser sentence. They still aren't seen as bad. Today the fashionable excuse is that they were probably defending themselves, even when there's no evidence of that. And statistics actually show that not all of it can be attributed to self-defense, right? So I still think that while there is that element of people having more concern about a woman because she's smaller, I think it's also because of this genuine misandry or this genuine lower empathy for men. Yeah, that's
Well,
what I feel.
two things can be true at the same time, A. And B, I don't think that we can take sentencing as a metric for anything, because I can tell you in my own experience with domestic violence, where I was in a situation where I ended up hospitalized, and I didn't even report my former spouse. An onlooker reported what they saw, and so it wasn't even. I didn't even have to say anything. Multiple people reported. I was in the hospital, and even still, with all the evidence, with all the texts and everything, that individual got a little bit of jail time and had to do like some counseling class that could be taken online. So domestic violence cases, generally speaking, aren't really that highly prosecuted. So it's hard for me to say like, oh, well, because she was a woman, she got 3 to 4 years, when I've experienced my own case in several cases through the course of that marriage where, you know, it seemed to be a little lax on the repercussion side. So
Well, it is very hard to go from one case to extrapolate that to the entirety of society. So it's not really good to like use anecdotes as statistics. But before I like before you chipped in before, I was actually going to mention a second point that's actually, I think, a lot more important to what I was saying, which was that women will use proxy violence and they will use more underhanded methods than men when they're actually trying to kill a man or, you know, even get him beaten up. I've had first-hand experience of this myself, where a woman's favorite weapon, in my personal experience, when she's trying to abuse someone, is to basically go over to her male friends, tell her male friends that this man over here is trying to hurt me, or he's creepy, or he makes me feel unsafe. And then the man goes over there and quote unquote deals with it for her.
I have a question. How come it's, beyond the lines of this conversation for me to use my personal anecdote?
Oh no, I wasn't saying that. I wasn't saying that at all.
Okay, but then you follow that immediately with a personal anecdote, so I was just a little confused.
Oh no, I meant I didn't mean that your personal experiences are invalid and my personal experiences are valid. I'm just saying that we can't really extrapolate to the whole of society. What I'm saying is that I have statistics as well that back this up. Basically, Warren Farrell's book has a bunch of citations on this, and we've got a couple of citations on the citation list dealing with women will mostly use proxy violence and mostly use like poison and things to kill people. If they're trying to kill someone. We also have citations showing that the majority of women who beat their partners were not abused, at least not by their partners. But we obviously, you need to be as careful of my anecdotes as I am of yours. I'm not saying that your anecdotes beat mine or vice versa. I'm sorry if I gave the false impression that that's what I was saying.
Like, there's one anecdote, one thing I would like to add is that even though you guys are correct, I would just like to add that that in addition to proxy violence, a lot of women, of course not most women, but if there's a domestic violence situation, a lot of the time, if a woman wants to abuse a man, she can use the state as part of a tool of abusing him, right? And in many countries, right? Usually because of the Duluth model, right? And a lot of men cannot do that, which they should not be able to do, by the way. That would be horrible, but I do think it's horrible because if a woman domestic violence abuses can actually do that, and that's also like very important information. Just like it's important to mention that women are on average physically weaker in general, right? Just as it's important to mention that the law isn't, men and women are not physically equal, they are not also legally equal in this circumstance either. And this is an important addition to the conversation.
But that's kind of typical in situations where people aren't physically equal, like in terms of the law. Like, for example, if someone is a teenager and they're fighting their parents, and teenagers at a certain age, they're 16 years old, they're fit and healthy, they can really do some damage. But if the parent responds adequately to them, they're still going to be held to a higher extent of the law because they're physically more capable in a lot of the cases with children, and also they're in a position of caregiving. So a lot of the times laws aren't necessarily equal when they view the victims or the people involved to have discrepancies in physicality.
Yeah, of course, but like my point is also this: is that like the idea that the man should always be arrested in in circumstances where there is an intimate violence between a man and a woman, regardless about who is hitting who and for whatever reason, right? So like if basically it's a reciprocal, if the only man is arrested in the reciprocal, is like presuming that the woman is innocent and the man is the aggressor, is not right. Absolutely not. And one example of that would be like if a woman were to beat a man with a baseball bat, then he would actually be arrested if she got a splinter from the baseball bat, because then it would be both parties sustain the damage. And yeah, and I do believe that there is a discrepancy if you see with physics, but like to have only women having all the protection, right? It's not like equalizing. It's not like handling it in a way that is in any way fair and nor just.
Just to add on what Jay Will said, so Athena, I do 100% get where you're coming from, but I just like to say I think today it's a bit too unbalanced. Like, let me just quickly share a story. You can find it in that movie, The Red Pill by Cassie J. Again, if you don't like Cassie J, that's fine. I'm just saying when you go look in that movie, you'll see there was this guy who was talking about his own experience with domestic abuse, right? And I think his name was Dean Esme or something else, but he was talking about his experience, and what he said is that when his wife or girlfriend would beat him up, like she would beat him up to the point where he started bleeding, and he would go to the police station while he was still bleeding, and they would literally just laugh at him and ignore him. And one time, one police officer told him something that really stuck in his mind. She told him, he told him, or she, I'm not sure what the gender of the police officer was, but they told him that if she starts hitting you, you better get out of there so fast, because if she breaks a nail while she's hitting you, we will come and we will arrest you, which is insane. I mean, it sounds like something out of a Monty Python sketch, and that was far from not far from the only case, right? He also talked about there was this time that there was this guy he knew who would get beaten up by his girlfriend or wife, and whenever she would start doing that, he would walk outside and stand in his driveway, just so that the neighbors could see that it was her beating him and not the other way around, because if they heard the sound, they might think that it was him beating her, and they would call the police and he would get arrested, right? So that's literally all he could do. And of course they didn't call the police to help him. They just left him to get beaten up, right? Which is pretty sad, right? So this is the response. Like, if you actually look at all the resources, and I can even share some with you, that when male domestic violence victims, they call the police, they call the hotlines, they call anyone, the response that they get is usually you must have hit her, and it's really disappointing, because sometimes they'll even call a hotline that specializes in this kind of thing, and then they'll literally try and gaslight him into admitting that he was actually the one hitting her, right? And they'll even say that the society around them wasn't helping them at all, and that they weren't able to find help. I mean, look at what happened to Earl Silverman, right? And Aaron Peasy. If anyone doesn't know who those people are, just ask me and I'll talk about them. But basically there's a really deeply entrenched hatred for male domestic violence victims, and any man that would dare try and of course this is not my own opinion, but like this is the opinion of people who feel like this, but there's like a deep hatred for men who would try and usurp the help that is being given to women, right? So sorry, equality for all, I of course it's not 100% of the time, but it happens a lot is what I'm saying. So I mean, in most countries, like even developed countries like Australia, UK, US, there's even Canada, there's very few domestic violence shelters for men, but an abundance for women, right? So, that's basically it.
Yeah, we do have a lot of men here, and quite probably on actually definitely on MensLib as well, who have experiences of being beaten and abused by women and then the police doing nothing. We saw some of their stories in the Chuck Derry AMA, which is, it should be in the link of this video if you're watching it later, because I've just added it. If you refresh the video, you might be able to see it, but I'm not sure if it'll update until after the video is basically up permanently and it stops streaming. But go through that and look at some of the stories they're telling him, and look at how he just totally ignores them.
I would also like to add to this is that good that you mentioned Australia, for example, because that's a country that actually have more domestic violence help or shelters for abused animals than for abused men, even though those are mainly funded by male taxpayers. And they also have to fund shit like Clementine Ford writing why coronavirus into killing men quickly enough, right? And all cunts like that doesn't deserve to fucking exist. And also and therefore the solution is to be a men's rights single issue voter, because if a government allows this to happen, then it's not a government that treats me as a human being, because a female supremacist state then.
I think that the law on paper should be gender neutral, and then aggravating or mitigating factors can be taken into account in court. Although I don't think gender should be considered either an aggravating or mitigating factor. But I do think that laws should be gender neutral on paper. And the Duluth model, the reason why the MensLib users are so surprised is because the Duluth model follows traditional feminist academic theory. And so there's a reason why male victims are not recognized under the Duluth model. And it's because male victims were not recognized under traditional feminist theory. They got the occasional lip service. Oh yeah, by the way, it happens to men too. But for the most part, the issue was completely neglected. And so that's why the AMA went the way it went. We weren't surprised. And that's the thing. I knew what was going to happen before it happened.
I think we all did. The moment you say Chuck Derry doing an AMA in MensLib, if you know who Chuck Derry is, then you know it's not going to go very well unless all the men in there are somehow not abuse victims. It's basically his modus operandi is to just totally ignore male victims of domestic violence. And yeah, I feel like we need to give male domestic violence charities a lot more power than they have, but it's very hard to see how we can do that whenever the conversation steers into domestic violence in the courts or in the like a government committee or anything like that. The feminist lobbies and all of that will exclude these male domestic violence charities from their official meetings with the government. And it's just they have all the power.
The solution is to use, if a government won't include those and only include the female ones, then the government is clearly a female supremacist government, and therefore people should vote against it. And therefore, you should look at it when it comes to politics. You look at them: are they want to extend domestic violence prevention or help for domestic violence victims to men? Doesn't mean that they should have equal funding. There should be not men who are generally tend to be 40%, right? Should at least get 40% of the funding, right? I'm not saying they should get equally funded. I'm saying they should more than they currently are, right? And if you bring out these politicians, and if they claim they're going to do something about it, then they should be supported. And if they don't, they should not be supported. And I believe that the best way is to just act politically as a men's rights single issue voter. And that's the only way they would listen, because if people care about other things more, then they don't have to care. So they don't.
The problem with all of these, like, suggestions you're making is, like, laws don't really tend to change unless there's an actual push for them to. And then you want to argue about, oh, well, a lot of these laws come from feminist theories and all these things, because that's who actually advocated for themselves to make the laws what they are. Men in mass aren't doing that. So I think to say that we should start from a legal level is kind of difficult, because that's just not how laws move or how laws get passed. You see, like, the groups, the minority groups, whether it be, any minority group that has any type of legal protection, are typically the ones who advocated to gain those legal protections. And you can see that in contrast with, like, a lot of Native American communities who struggle to get a lot of advocacy because their numbers are so small. So I think it really has to be a grassroots type of push, because just to say, oh, the law should be this, yeah, well, who's spending their time lobbying for that? You know what I mean?
Well, the thing with that is
Yeah.
the people who change the laws are the representatives we vote in, and senators, presidents. And to get laws changed the way we want them, we need to vote in the people who stand for our views, which, firstly, currently is not the easiest thing to find in the political world. And secondly, we need to get people to vote for that. And whether we'd like to admit it or not, one of our biggest problems as a movement is getting people to realize what they can actually change. In a lot of countries, there still is enough of a male voting population to make that kind of change. It just doesn't happen because they're all split up with their different opinions and beliefs.
Well,
That's why
the only reason that political leaders campaign on certain ideas is because they think enough people care about it. If enough people express that that's something they're passionate about, then more people will take that on in their campaigns towards being elected. But right now, if no one says shit about it, how are they going to know that that's something they should advocate for? If the loudest voices in the conversation are saying the antithesis of that, which are like feminists and other groups who don't support those types of things, who's going to be the lone wolf to stand in front of a quiet room with no people in the audience and say, yeah, I'm going to campaign on this, when no one's asking them to? Nobody. That's not how it works. So if people make their voice heard, like, this is something we want, this is advocacy that we want, then politicians and people who are running to be elected will put that on their campaign if they feel that that's something that's passionate for them, and then those people can then vote for it.
Yes, exactly, and that's the reason
Currently,
why
it's not in there because we don't have people supporting that like we all do. We don't have enough people supporting that for them to care.
I think what is important right now, I think what is really important right now is a little bit of conscious raising and a little bit of raising of awareness. Because okay, here's my view on things, and of course you can disagree with me. But what I think right now is that people are really, really, really brought up with the patriarchy theory and the misogyny theory, right? That, we're living in like a patriarchal, misogynistic world and that kind of thing, that women are like continuously pressed down by men, and men are just, they have, to quote Peggy McIntosh, an invisible knapsack of privileges, right? So I think that if people approach it from that point of view, they're always going to see, we need to protect women first and foremost, and that kind of thing. However, if we do a bit of conscious raising like we're doing today, to actually show using studies and using empirical data that actually it's not really connected to patriarchy or things like that, or at least not in the US or a lot of Western countries, right? Even in countries like Germany, that's not the case, right? So it's not been that that for a long time, right? People have always been against domestic violence towards women in most communities. Even when you read the Bible, they're against domestic violence. And the Bible is pretty extreme, right? So, sorry, Christians. Yeah. But anyway, so like, I think what is one thing that's really important right now is just to do some conscious raising, right? So just basically to continue the same thing that we're doing now. Of course, I really appreciate Ma and the other activists who are doing, they're part of the National Coalition of Men, and they're doing actual like legislative activism. Right now, I don't really do that in Kenya because I'm pretty much the only person here that thinks about such, right? So there's no organization that does things like that here, or at least not if I check. But I just think that the conscious raising is really important, and it's a powerful thing, right? Because it was also something that feminists did in the beginning. They would also do a lot more raising of awareness about certain issues, right? So that was something that really was big in the 1970s. That's when they really wanted to raise consciousness about domestic violence, and that's what really made it to be seen as, a really big societal, structural, systemic issue that it was today. People in the past, they viewed it as horrible and wrong, but they didn't think that it was a structural thing because, anyone who did it was actually punished and that kind of thing. But, so I just really think conscious raising is really important in this situation.
Yeah, one thing I would like to say to the men's libbers that I think they should think about is if the patriarchy is really the cause of all of men's problems, then why is it that the people who seem to have the ear of the patriarchy and the only ones who seem to be able to get it to do anything are the feminists? How is it?
I will point out that MensLib generally does not believe in patriarchy theory. I've
Well,
been
do
on
they
there
not?
for a while. They generally
Are you
don't know.
sure?
From what I've
Oh,
seen, a lot of MensLib blames the patriarchy for a lot of the so-called patriarchy for a lot of men's problems. That it puts a lot of social pressure on men to stay in their role and for women to stay in their role, and that's how it's supposed to be. That these are the roles of society, and it's the problem of the so-called patriarchy in order that these roles exist in the way they do.
so they do believe in patriarchy then?
They believe the current, what would be called patriarchy by feminists, the cultural status quo, is what they blame. They blame the cultural status quo. Mainly the rich elite guys who sit at the top. Generally, patriarchy refers to the rich white elite, not men in general. Though it often is interpreted that way by newer feminists.
I think that is a lot more clearly described as an oligarchy than a patriarchy.
It's
Or
elitism.
including everyone, it would probably be a kyriarchy. If gender is or non-economic power is a big factor, then I would call it a lot easier to describe it as an oppressive kyriarchy. But it really, from my perspective, looks a whole lot more like rule by wealth rather than rule by the father. I mean, I've been around a long time and known a lot of very powerless, very disenfranchised and disadvantaged humans that happen to be male. So, the idea of a hierarchy based on the pater, on fatherhood,
On the patriarch.
that just doesn't hold enough water to say, yeah, here's the problem.
It's
Well-
elitism, not patriarchy.
Pretty much, yeah.
The
Well-
elites just happen to be mostly rich white men whose great grandfathers owned like Standard Oil.
Yeah, and who are
Well,
those
I
rich white
think
men
the
married to
patriarchy.
usually?
I
Yeah.
think the patriarchy, at least in the way that I view it, is not like something that somebody just created one day. I think it's rooted in what's believed to be the laws of nature, the laws of like biology
Yes.
and how we choose partners and how we have moved and progressed through society, and patriarchy meaning that men are the leaders of society, meaning that men are leaders of the home, leaders of the country, leaders of wars, leaders of all of these things. And it's not just something like, oh, men just got together one day and decided we're the patriarch. It's the concept and the notion that goes back to our earliest human foundation that has built upon and built upon for generations and generations and generations until this day. I don't think it's like
Yeah,
something
that's the
thought up.
academic explanation.
Patriarchy is generally the idea of that, historically speaking, men have been the leaders of society, and women
Well,
have generally been underneath them.
they've mostly held political power.
Yes.
You know, okay, I'm just
It's a
gonna
little
give,
bit more. Okay.
you know, okay. Yeah, sorry. Let me just quickly give my rundown of what I think. And you know, okay, here's the thing. I do come from like a radical feminist background. You know, I was really into like, you know, smash the patriarchy and, you know, everything is set up to benefit men and that kind of thing. But, you know, the more I began to read into this topic, you know, I think that especially in the beginning, for example, patriarchy was the most convenient way of society, and I'll give you a reason why I'm saying that, right? So let's say, for example, you're a woman living in, you know, before before Christ, right? And you know, most of the time you're pregnant because not only did women have to have a lot of children because a lot of children died in childbirth, they had to also make up for the women who are dying in childbirth. Of course, this wasn't the fault of, you know, men depriving them of food or anything like that. No, it's just because, you know, childbirth for a long time has been really difficult and really hard, and you know, it's something that could kill you, right? So it was really dangerous, right? So because of this, a lot of women had to have a lot of children, right, to make up for the children that died and also the other women who passed away, right? So because of this, a woman would spend most of her time, you know, taking care of young children and, you know, also having to, you know, spend time pregnant, right? And, you know, when you're pregnant, you can't really do a lot of work, right? So, and also remember that this was a time when we didn't have technology and society wasn't very, very secure, right? In the past, they didn't really have what we call the police, right? You know, society was a lot more dangerous than how it is today, right? So let's say, for example, you're a woman and you have a husband. Your husband not only has to do most of the difficult agriculture, you know, because back then most of the work was, you know, people living in a small plot of land and having their own little farm, right? He would have to do most of the heavy work in the farm. He would have to protect you from wild animals, from invaders, from thieves, from whatever. And you as a woman, you couldn't do most of the really difficult farm work and you couldn't protect yourself, especially if you were pregnant, right? So this naturally became that, you know, men had to be the providers and the protectors of women, right? And of course, this eventually devolved into, because men have to have this massive responsibility for women, they also have to be able to lead women. Because, you know, if you're pregnant and you're taking care of your kids most of the time, it doesn't really leave enough time for power playing, you know, time for you to be a president or a prime minister or a king or anything like that, you know. So it was mostly men who was doing those things, you know. And of course this devolved into gender roles, which I still think are really, really restrictive, and I don't fully agree with them. But I do admit that to some extent they do have some bearing on, you know, the physical reality of what was there for a long time, right? And, you know, you could also argue that women didn't have to get married. You know, if they didn't want to, they couldn't. They shouldn't have gotten married or anything like that. But you know, be honest. Like if you were a woman in that day and age, there was no contraception, right? So you were either gonna have to stay celibate all your life, and you'd have to work all those difficult jobs like being a blacksmith. And again, women were allowed to work. It's not that they were just banned from being blacksmiths or anything like that. They were allowed to, you know, and we have gilded records that show this, right? So either, you know, that was being a celibate blacksmith all your life, or you could get married to someone whom you actually liked and have children with them, right? So because of this, there was a lot of responsibility put on men. But now here's where me and some feminists start to deviate. They think that those privileges that men had in the past, which were responses to their responsibilities, they think that that was male privilege, and that was society being set up to benefit men and not women. For example, let's say if the son is given the priority of inheritance, or the what is called the male primogeniture, I think that's how you say it. It meant that, you know, society wants women to be poor, and your society wants women to not be powerful or anything like that. That's not true. The reason why he was given that priority is because he was expected to get married, sometimes to someone of not even of his own choosing, and support her for the rest of his life and any children that she has, right? You know, so if he had to be the leader of his family, it was also because in many cultures, if the wife or the kids did anything wrong, he would be held accountable for it. You know, this like the UK and the US society took this to the extreme when they said that if your wife is fined, you have to pay the fine. If your wife commits a crime, you have to go to jail. You know, they took that to the extreme, right? So actually, if you actually look at it, like a lot of these so-called male privileges are actually just male responsibilities, right? And there were a lot of things. That's why I'm saying you can't just look at one side of the story. You have to look at all the advantages that women have had throughout history. You know, women never had to die in war. Women mostly weren't being as tortured as men were by the state, you know, with all these horrible, you know, public tortures and everything like that. Women were almost never subjected. Sometimes they were even barred from having that punishment given to them, right? So there was a lot, you know, that people, you know, don't consider when they talk about this. So that's what I feel.
Well, I think that to say you can't look at one side of the picture is kind of an irrelevant statement in this conversation, because I don't feel that anybody here has done that. And I think that most all of us were just saying that when we're talking about patriarchy, we are talking about the concept and the idea that men are the leaders of society and their
Oh yeah,
households,
certainly.
etc.
I'm not saying that
Of the
people
same
here have
reason
been doing that.
that,
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that other people, like maybe, for example, maybe
yeah,
some radical feminists, they had been the one to look at things from only one side of the picture, but not anyone here. So
right.
sorry for that
So
criticism.
yeah, so I'm saying, like, agreeing with all the things that you're saying. When people say that we live in a society where, you know, it still has a lot of semblance and elements of patriarchy, and because we look at the world leaders, we look at these things, it's not that we're saying like who has all of the privilege. It's that we're saying that we still have semblance of the past. And when we say things like, oh, this is an element of patriarchy backfiring, such as like child support and all of these things, we're saying that these ideas that men should be burdened with this level of responsibility on behalf of women comes from the same ideas from long ago, that women are the caregivers and men are the providers. It's not saying that it's privilege, ha ha ha, blew up in your face. We're saying that these concepts are notions that come from way, way, way back in human history that we are still attached to.
I kind of think we need to draw a strong distinction here between small p patriarchy, which is just ruled by men, and large p patriarchy, which is patriarchy theory, which says men have ruled all of society for the benefit of men exclusively and have used that power and privilege to oppress women since the dawn of time, which is demonstrably not true. And I think we need to basically take a good hard look at any claim that stems from that, because Duluth model and several other major feminist talking points and theories and laws and things like that are designed with the assumptions of patriarchy, capital P patriarchy, while
Well,
living in a society that may be small p patriarchy.
Well, while that's true and that's mostly relevant in a lot of the discussions we have, I don't think that's particularly relevant when someone in this chat is explaining that no, MensLib in this context doesn't view patriarchy as the reason why these things are happening. They're saying in the way that you just described, the big P. They're saying patriarchy as in the ideas and the notions that come from concepts long ago. That's what they're saying. So in these types of conversations, like the one we're having right now, where someone's explaining to you that no, we're not standing by patriarchy theory, we're just saying that patriarchy in its true core as a concept is why a lot of the problems are occurring.
Okay, but we need to first examine one thing, right? Because
What do you
this is
then mean by patriarchy is the question, because you're using patriarchy as the reason, but what do you mean then?
Who was that to?
To you, you're saying patriarchy is the reason for all the things that are happening. What do you describe
No,
as
no, no. I
patriarchy?
was saying somebody earlier was explaining the MensLib subreddit. I'm not a part of that. I was just saying I think that that's what they were referring to. That wasn't my argument.
Fair enough.
okay. So here's the thing. Here's what I would like to ask. Okay, not to Athena, but well, it's more of a rhetorical ask than anything. But like, we need to probably question, ourselves to see if, this so-called patriarchy was done to benefit men at the expense of women. Because okay, here's the thing: if, for example, patriarchy was formed because and unfortunately women could not engage in the same things that men could engage in a long time ago, but the essential feature of feminism, especially radical feminism, is that patriarchy, misogyny, they're all tied together because society was set up to benefit men, and that men have the same privilege that I'm just giving an example here. White people in maybe the US, that white people, they did do certain things a long time ago to benefit themselves over people of other races, and they exploited them and that kind of thing. So a lot of the theories that radical feminists have ties into this, that men have all the power because they specifically created society to benefit men at the expense of women, and women are just the oppressed underdogs, who everybody hates and who, everybody is distrustful of. And, the same way that, like, okay, here's the thing. Maybe some people here have not read into a lot of radical feminist theory. But when you read the works of people like Simone de Beauvoir and Andrea Dworkin, right, you begin to see that a lot of radical feminists, they just genuinely do believe that society hates women and that society is benefiting from the exploitation of women, and specifically men are benefiting from the exploitation of women, So that is where I disagree with a lot of feminists, because I always have this joke: if if men really set up society to benefit them, they miss the mark on almost everything, like it's so it's either that men didn't set up society to benefit them, that they only did certain things to benefit themselves in relation to their obligations as as fathers and husbands, right? or they did set up society to benefit them, and they're really, really, really incompetent at it, which is really unlikely, because to me, when we look at a concept, let's say for example of a feminist saying this is male privilege backfiring, I would argue that it's not male privilege backfiring, it's actually a feature of this so-called patriarchy, because it was never set up to benefit men at the expense of women. It was done, if anything, for women's benefit, so that women wouldn't have to, suffer all the same things as men were suffering, right? Women most of the time, if they were married, especially in a stable marriage, they wouldn't have to worry about things like earning an income, or at least being the primary earner. Women wouldn't have to worry too much about going and dying in war or protecting their families from a foreign enemy. Women wouldn't have to worry about, whether their children were going to eat or anything. That was most of the things that men had to care about, and if the husband wasn't there to protect the woman, it was some other guy who was doing it, right? I don't think that those are examples of male privilege backfiring. I think that was the intention. That was always the intention, to protect and provide for women, So, but that's where you kind of see that,
I don't think the
so.
claim is that it's male privilege. I think they say it's patriarchy backfiring.
No, but it's also, I've seen a lot of feminists say this is just male privilege backfiring. Like, let me give you an example, because we were talking about the concept of domestic violence. They're like, this is male privilege backfiring because, men are seen as the top dogs in society, and that women are seen as so inferior that they can't possibly be violent towards a man, because like it's embarrassing for a man to be beaten up by a woman because like women are so inferior. But to me that doesn't make a lot of sense, because like I brought up this topic earlier, if it was really true that women were the hated, like, I'm using the word minority in quotes, I think I hope you guys understand what I mean by this, but like, if women were like really the hated minority, they would be saying that like violence against men is worse than violence against women, and then they would be saying that women are much more violent than women actually being violent. Like you can see this, like for example, like the Nazis, like they would constantly portray like the Jews as being really violent, despite the fact that most of them were not, or that African American men were like really violent, again, despite the fact that most of them were not. So like there's not been a single oppressed class in history that was seen as incapable of violence, right? So let's say, for example, like we were living in a really misogynistic society that was based around the protection and care of men and the degradation and hatred of women, right? We'd actually be seeing the opposite. We'd be seeing much more care being given to male victims of domestic violence. We'd be seeing like hotlines reading, not hotlines, sorry, what is it called? Billboards saying, end violence against men. You'd see people saying, stop killing men. You'd be seeing things like that, right? So so this thing that it's because we live in a misogynistic world and everyone just loves men and everyone hates women is the reason why people are really, really, really like toxic towards male victims of domestic violence. I just don't agree with it. I mean, I just do not see it. It's not based on misogyny. Like if you look at Richard Felston's studies, the fact that they were more concerned about a woman being beaten, it's not because they were like, haha, dumb woman, we hate women, but we just don't want her to get beaten up. No, they were really concerned about a guy hitting his wife at a conference or a party or something like that. It never stemmed from a hatred of women, or anything like that. So I just don't agree with those theories that some people have, right?
Yeah, I do really, really take issue with the idea that it's backfiring, because the assumption there is that men designed this system to benefit them. But if the system is, as one of its fundamental components, forcing men to go off to war and selecting them randomly across the country using the draft, then how is that backfiring? I mean, that seems like a feature rather than a bug.
Exactly what I was saying. Like that's always been the goal. It's not like men were like, oh, we're so much better than women and we are out to oppress women. Oh, oopsie, that means that we're gonna have to go to war. No, like that's never been a thing. It's never been about a hatred of women or anything about that. Like I heard a feminist on Twitter who was talking about this, and she's a very sweet lady, right? But she was saying that the reason why men was sent to war and women were not is because people view women as weak and that kind of thing. Again, I don't really think that's based on misogyny either, because even if your argument is that women shouldn't go to war because women are physically weaker than men, I mean that's somewhat true. Not that I think that women should be banned from entering military service. That's not what I think. But of course women are not going to be able to do all the same physical things that men are going to do, right? And women don't even really want this, right? So if you look at an example like Israel, which has service for women, right? For women, it's only 2 years. For men, it's 2.5 years, right? It's 2.5 years. And even if you're a woman and you enter, you can also leave for citing religious reasons, right? Because like if you look at the Old Testament or the Torah, it's actually only men going to war, not women, right? So for example, if you're a Jewish woman, you
Religious reasons are only for people attending religious schools or who are a religious minority. That's basically the only way that ever works out.
okay, but if you're a woman, you can also say it's for religious reasons. But you can't say that.
I would think the better thing to focus on is that we as societally we need to start appreciating some of the things that men are doing for women generally, like being the majority of the top jobs, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the thing is that it's generally like expected of them. That's just what they're expected to do. So they're just it's kind of seen as doing their job. A good example is you don't thank the police for making sure everyone's following the speed limit. You just expect them to do it. And if they're doing it, they're just doing what they're supposed to.
Well, I would think you can thank a police officer if he's trying to help somebody out or delivering fair judgment.
Yeah, if they're going like out of their way to do things, they're generally thanked for it because it's considered above and beyond what they're supposed to be doing. But if you just do what you're seen as what you're supposed to do, it's generally a thankless task.
Well, that's usually with men. I don't think I've seen women doing what is expected of them, being not
healthcare work.
Yeah, that's not true, because if you look at, I know that there's this phenomena of people like a mom will do their kid's hair and it's like another Tuesday, a dad will do their daughter's hair and it'll be like 5 million views on YouTube, or like a dad will get praise for taking their kids to the doctor. Whereas like a mom's just kind of like, yeah, you take your kids to the doctor. And I know like a lot of men who like say, well, I take care of my kids. Like that's like an additional point. Like, oh, you shouldn't have to inherently take care of your children. So I do kind of agree that about the thankless job with people performing things that are traditionally seen as their gender roles being basically an expectation. And I have to admit that I kind of do hold that sentiment as well, like, but then again, I'm more of a traditional person, so
I think we don't have to praise them every step of the way, but just once in a while, just being like, hey, thanks for doing this, even if it's your job, it can go a long way for a lot of people. And yeah, you need to be careful about it becoming meaningless because it's being praised too much. But that's why you do it with the thankless jobs and the thankless tasks that people do.
If you're doing what's expected of you as a person is generally like, oh, they're doing what they're supposed to. It's you don't generally you'll thank someone if they're doing something extraordinary or if it's the expectation to thank them. So a lot of people will. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to
Yeah,
agree
I
with the
agree.
theme here. You know, because okay, here's the thing. I'm a woman, right? And I hope to one day have children, right? And I really, really hope that if I do end up with a male partner, people won't do that annoying thing where they're like, you know, they see me take care of my kids for like 8 hours a week, and then like if he plays for them for 2 minutes, they'd be like, oh my god, you are so lucky, he's such a catch, like he's the best father ever. Because I will literally scream, you know. I'm all about fighting sexism against both genders. It's not okay when it's a man, it's not okay when it's a woman, right? I also think that, you know, mothers or you know, female caregivers or female, you know, sisters or everything like that, they should also get praised for taking care of children and, you know, doing the things that they're supposed to do. I understand that a lot of these issues go both ways, right? So like I just don't like how it's just expected for girls to do like house chores, and sometimes it's not expected from men. Like I'm Indian, and luckily I didn't have a problem with this, but you know, some people would tell me that when they were growing up, like um if there's like a grandma who's in the house, and then there's like a young girl like sitting maybe just watching TV, and her brother is also sitting with her and watching TV, the grandma is going to come to her and tell her, why are you just sitting there? Why don't you go make some noodles for your brother? And like why can't he go make noodles for her? Like why does she have to do everything? Like it's, you know, I don't like this like common stereotype of like, you know, men sitting on the couch and you know, women doing everything. Like it's just wrong. You know, it
Well,
shouldn't happen.
I think with that, it's generally in the well, in a traditionalist sense, the grandmother is trying to give the girl the opportunity to learn a skill that she thinks is valuable to her, which is, well, home ec, basically. And the boy is gonna learn a trade or any kind of education or something. That's what a traditionalist view would be. I don't think it necessarily has to be like that. Uh, and yeah, if the boy later on just keeps doing play stuff and not actually doing any chores or anything that is remotely seen as contributing to the household or to studies or
Like
something, then yeah, he
yeah,
would
exactly,
be
again
privileged.
it's
That's true.
pretty stupid, you know, for these like these expectations these days. I understand that, you know, in the past like there were only certain things that men could do because, you know, of the physical nature of the work, but like these days it's just stupid, you know, because like in my family, for example, all of my brothers are like dependent on like the female family members, and most of the female family members have jobs, you know, and still yet like the female family members are expected to do like housework and manage the home, but like the men, you know, they get to have like their resting time, and even if they don't even have jobs, like it makes no sense, you know.
Sounds
So
like the exact opposite of most of the West.
exactly, you know.
That's still wrong. I would agree
Of
with that.
course. Yeah.
Well, I just feel that wrong is subjective because if some people choose to, I just think equality is important in relationships. And some people may view that as a 50-50 divide of all tasks, all workload, all bills, all home chores. But some may think 50-50 is okay, you hold down the home and I do the economic stuff, and that's you doing half the work and I'm doing the other half. It's still 50-50. So I feel like every individual couple should have the agency to decide how they want to break up the tasks.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's
100%
like what
agree
was
with you.
described was the women being the workers and the homemakers. And
Exactly.
that's doing all the work while the men are just, well, if the men are really good at giving the women leisure, I would say, the relieving stress, to say it nicely.
No,
Then
they're siblings.
maybe
They
the
don't do
women.
any. They don't do
Oh,
anything
sibling.
of
Oh,
that.
sorry, no, that's not it. Yeah, but
Oh
if they're
my
sibling,
god.
To make it a little more serious,
that's interesting.
Athena, what you were just saying about granting individual persons the agency to make adult decisions about, how life is going to be lived as a couple, how life is going to be lived as a family. That's, in my view, that's the way forward. That before anything else. But I also have to say that just saying, well, that's the way it ought to be, doesn't get us there. Society, the hierarchy, whatever you want to say, the culture applies great pressure on men, to tell them this is not something for you to choose to do or not do. Here is what you must do, and if you don't do it, you will have nothing.
Well, I feel that there are a
Correspondingly,
lot of cultural shifts.
they say the same thing to girls becoming women. This is not something, for you to figure out how to negotiate with your future partner. This is your life. You're going to be a nurturer, you're going to be a caregiver, and you're going to, be a mom. You're going to be a feminine component of society, and that's just the way it is. And we have painted ourselves into a corner in modern life, out of which we cannot get until we recognize that this should never be something that people are coerced into doing, but something that they need to learn how to choose to do. If we can't do that, then all the discussion, about who has it worse and who's doing it wrong, isn't going to take us anywhere. We have to figure out what to do.
Well, I think that you're discounting the amount of cultural shifts, at least in the West, that are moving towards diversity of gender expression, gender roles, how people conduct themselves in relationships. I'm not wishing upon a star here. I'm looking at the actual trends of peers within Gen Z, which is the future, and future generations, and their attitudes and their approaches towards dating and towards living their life and expressing their gender and their sexuality and how they choose to engage in personal relationships. So I'm not just like choosing, sporadically. Like I'm not somebody who's looking at it from what is Gen X, like what is Gen X doing. I'm looking at it from what are the youth doing? What are the conversations that are here? What are the relationships I'm seeing amongst my peers? And from what I am seeing, most generally, relationships tend to be largely egalitarian. Relationships can also be more traditional, and I'm seeing a lot of variety. And I'm also seeing couples making that decision for themselves within the context of their personal relationship.
That's interesting that you say that because, and I confess I'm a boomer, but from what I see from this much higher level, is not very much harmony and not very much sense of agency. I'm seeing a lot of despair. I'm seeing a lot of frustration. I'm seeing a lot of anger. I'm seeing a lot of unwillingness to play the game anymore. Seeing a lot of resentment. So maybe you and I are just traveling in different circles, but I, just honest statement, I don't see what you're seeing.
I can agree with that.
I'd be the connecting point here. Just
Well, it's about relationships over several different generations, and Athena was talking more about Gen X,
Gen
the new
Z.
generation.
Yeah.
Gen Z.
Well,
Gen
you know,
Gen Z.
Gen Z
yeah.
is Gen Z is
I mean,
complicated.
it's
When it comes to
barely
their
18, I think.
views.
Or the youngest, the oldest one.
Yeah. Gen Z
I think it, I think it
older is more
depends on what I think it depends on what circle that you're in, because honestly, here's the thing. From what I've seen, there are many pockets of people who actually mostly, like what Athena is saying, they have a more liberal view of relationships that, these days, they don't like saying the word wife, they like using the word partner, instead of like husband and wife. But like, I've been looking at these fundamentalist, like um, evangelist people, and them, they really want to hold on to traditional gender roles, but they're doing it like with a modern twist, right? And for a lot of couples, I have a lot of Southern Baptist friends, right? And they're genuinely happy, like the husbands like really treat the wives well, and they're really happy. They really take pride in how happy they make their families, and how happy they make their kids and wives and that kind of thing, but I've also seen people talking about it online, that like, the modern and the traditional fusion has really made things difficult, especially for women, because like the women are now also expected to bring in some sort of income, and they're pretty much blamed for whatever the guy does. Like, even if he goes like out and like maybe doesn't come to church or whatever, the girl, or the wife, she'll be blamed. She'll be like, why aren't you making him come to church or something like that? Or if he does something wrong, she's blamed for it, and
well,
she now
not
has a
always.
lot of course, yeah, it depends
That
on.
sounds a lot like a more traditional model where the power of the female is recognized. The social
honestly
power, I would say.
Honestly, I don't know, because like, here's the thing. They seem to have this weird thing where they view women as, again, this is not all Southern Baptists or all evangelicals, of course. This is just a minority of them. But like in these some really fundamentalist pockets, like they have this view that women are simultaneously inferior and also responsible for all the sins of man, right? So like, for example, they'll say, because of Eve, it's only women who commit sins, it's not men. If men are committing sins, it's only because some woman somewhere convinced them to, which is really stupid in my opinion. Like, again, I know that the vast majority of people, even Christians, they don't believe this, but that's why I'm saying, like, people can pretty much use whatever book or whatever they want to justify their own hatred, of people. So I was actually talking to some of these people, and I asked them, why the women even put up with this. Like, I mean, even me, like, even if I was raised in evangelical or whatever, like, if I was to constantly be held accountable for another person's actions, I would, while simultaneously being told that they're my superior and that they get to do whatever they want to me, including being physically violent towards me, I would just leave after a while, because I would not put up with it, especially in a country like in the US, where women don't have to put up with domestic violence. you know so then they told me that, again, it's maybe because they're afraid of hell, or because they're brainwashed or whatever. So that's what I heard about it.
Well, because we're in a weird
I-
period when
I've never
it
heard of
comes
it.
to Gen Z. Sorry, Ma.
I was just going to say, I'm Christian. I've never, ever heard anything about this. It's the first time
Are you familiar with Southern Baptist?
I've heard of them, but I haven't really, like they're not really on my radar.
I'm familiar because I was in that, and I think I mentioned earlier that I was married right out of high school into that, and it was very much of what Kate is saying to be pretty accurate to my experience.
Like,
Yeah.
But
because,
of course,
okay,
that's a
Well,
subsect
just
of people. That's not like widespread, I don't think.
yeah, of course
well,
not.
different churches do different things. I mean, I'm not the most religious person. I do have a lot of church friends though, and it's very interesting to see that they all claim to be Christian, or I'll have like three of them be Southern Baptist, and each church says they're completely different things. So as Kate was saying, it literally depends on your circle. And then Athena, going back to your Gen Z thing, I think when it comes to Gen Z, it's so complicated because we're all in so many different circles. You know, we've got a lot of people who are realizing, and I know this because there's a lot of group of my own friends, and a lot of people just around that are egalitarians or equalists, and they're very open-minded, and they're having very 50-50 relationships and working things out. You've also got, as Kate brought up, the circle of people are religious, some people are more traditional. We still got the circle of radicals, which, if we are going to tie this to gender issues, I think when it comes to Gen Z, sorry to offend any other Gen Zers in here, but just to be completely, absolutely truthful, the biggest problems are the people who are screaming the loudest currently are the people who seem to be going out into some of these protests, and a lot of them are very, very, very uninformed about what the protest is about or the movement or anything. And so they're just stating and reposting opinions again and again and again. That's how we end up in our situation with misinformation and lies and everything we're at right now. Because they are the loudest speaking people. The egalitarians are awesome, but they sort of got a lame attitude. They're not fighting for anything really. They just act that way in their normal life. They're not speaking up. And so, you know, it's sort of I don't want to say they don't care, but they're very lax about everything and just don't see a point in speaking.
When I see egalitarian, I wasn't necessarily meaning like people who are very like activists. I meant more like people that I know.
Yeah, relationship wise. Yeah, I understood what you said. I'm just saying if I'm connecting this with activism, I'm just saying to the activism part of it, our largest speaking group as a generation currently is the uninformed that are going into these protests causing this misinformation and stuff that's currently going on where we've got like people reposting and people supporting all this stuff and then actually not reading anything they posted or anything at all. So they have zero idea what they're doing, but since everyone else is doing it, they want to join. And then we have this basically a mob mentality, a clueless mob mentality of them just following whatever this group or movement is that they support, that they're uninformed about.
Don't you just then need some good informed leaders or that are able to properly or make sure to guide the group well, basically?
You would think that you really would think that, but
Yeah. I
some of
mean, you're
them
always
they
going to have
just don't want to learn it too.
different
That's the other
rhetorics
problem.
being
Ignorance is bliss.
shared. Yeah.
Go ahead,
Well,
sorry. I didn't-
if you got a good slogan or a good way of conveying information, or just tell them to go to specific YouTube channels, so inform people, that kind of stuff, then we can if we can at least convince politicians, like we've talked about earlier, then we can get legislation and it'll be more fair for people rather than as one-sided as a lot of radical feminists bring into it.
I do think that the point Darkeisha made was also like pretty valid though, like about how it definitely your social circle's going to shape how you view these things, because my social circle of people in their early 20s living in Los Angeles who are in creative employment, you know, is not going to be the same as somebody in the South in a Southern Baptist community, which is not going to be the same as a bunch of like Ivy League people in New England, which is not going to be the same as anywhere else in the world. So it definitely depends on your group. That's going to inform the way that you see things. But I do think, just at least from what I see in social media as well, it seems to be that there are a lot of shifts in ideologies towards gender dynamics within relationships.
Experience my own age and social cohort, basically, mid 50s to mid 60s white guys. If you want to talk about a lack of awareness and an inurement, getting used to just things being the way they are, you got to talk to some of them, because it's very difficult, like the conversation we're having here, it's very difficult to have anything like that kind of conversation with them. They've lived many decades under, the status quo, and it's very hard to see anything else. It's a very painful process for me to get to the point where I don't do that anymore, and where I work to become as aware as I possibly can, and to pay attention. But Athena, you're right. It's it's not what is being talked about in those circles, but rather what is not being talked about. That causes all the trouble. And I don't blame people in the millennial and Gen Z generations, to take the attitude toward us of, you're just waiting for us to die because we're useless. And believe me, I've had exactly that kind of conversation with, like I say, with my own cohort, because it's true. It's very hard for them to see what is really going on from all angles. And that goes as much for the women in my age and demographic as the men. Everything we're talking about here, that we talk about comfortably, for them is terrifying and taboo. It's just too much. But somebody has to do it.
Well, first, Celeste, I don't think anybody's waiting for you guys to drop dead. And Athena can correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like maybe a big attitude with some of the younger generations is the older people may have screwed up this world, and we sure as hell don't want it.
Yep. And I gotta confess, when I look around at things as they are now and remember, the life I lived and the culture that I came up in, very hard for me not to say, yep, they're right, we screwed up, but as much by what we failed to do as anything we did. And one thing we failed very badly at, Athena, going to you, my age and demographic cohort, failed outright to encourage and enact a sense of agency in the generations coming up behind us, to be able to take their own responsibility for living their own life. We presented them with a set of gender roles and class roles and so forth, and said, this is the way things are. You have no choice. You have no agency. This is what you will be. And that was a huge mistake.
I've noticed that, because personally, when it comes to dating, I never really had much, I don't think age is that big of a deterrent for me. And so I've dealt with people younger than me and as well as older than me, 10 plus years my senior. And the differences are very drastic, in my opinion. And what you're saying about this is the way it is, I've experienced that on the older end of the spectrum, where it's no, you're the woman. I'm picking what's on the menu when we go to the dinner. I'm paying for everything. I'm opening the door. I'm picking you up, that type of traditionalism. And then I've seen on the opposite end with younger people, it's just way more lax. It's well, what do you want to do? what is this? Are we gonna, it's just a different type of conversation. So I do think that there are like generational differences, but I think younger people are more likely to try to set the dynamic that they particularly like they themselves want versus like older people. I think they just go with what they've been taught for a long time.
I don't think we have to necessarily move away from that for the older people to convince them that a different dynamic is generally better for society. It's more so making people realize that some things are uh, more gender neutral than a specific gender faces it more, basically, which is the biggest issue I have with some things. Like, well, a lot of people got uh, justifiably angry with how Texas is treating the abortion laws, but nobody gets angry about male circumcision, for example. And that's also things like a woman's body is sacred, but a man's body is allowed to be violated at birth just because people have thought up of really weird reasons why they should be altered and that kind of thing. And you don't really, I don't think that the older generation would be against that if you explain it to them in a different way. Like there's more ways to more roads that lead to Rome in a certain way. And I think that for different generations you need different vehicles to get them there.
I think that one quote I was seeing float around the internet is that if men could get pregnant, there would be abortion centers on every corner or something like that, and like it really shows me like what
Like male
people
abuse
think.
shelters are at every corner for men right now, right?
Kate, Kate,
Yeah, so
something that
is someone
happens
calling
in
me?
your yeah, something that happens in your head is not a valid example for the real world. Just that.
Okay, here's the reason why I kind of disagree with that, right? Because if we look at men how they are right now, right?
In what sense?
Yeah,
Be clear.
meaning like for example, like what he said about circumcision, right? About what he said about the draft, right? About the fact that something which is called financial abortion, which I don't really agree with, could be considered, but it's not, of course, right? There's still many, many ways that, men as of now, even without having the ability to be pregnant, they're still having some responsibilities, or they're still having their bodies violated in ways that, women are not, right? So I just really don't agree with the fact that if men had been able to get pregnant, that they would automatically have been given the right to have an abortion or something like that. I just disagree with that, right? And another reason, like let me give you another example, right? So I was talking to a feminist one of these days who was arguing with me, and he or she was basically telling me systemic historical discrimination against men does not exist because, one of the reasons she gave is that men never had to fight for the right to vote, right? And then, I told her literally, men literally, as in the literal sense of the word, had to fight for the right to vote because if they did not agree to get drafted, they literally could not vote. So yeah, in the most literal sense of the word, men literally did have to fight for the right of the vote, to the right to vote. And this, of course, is not taking into account the Chartists who did try to extend voting rights to middle class men, and even they were unsuccessful. You know, and they were like beaten. They were treated very horribly by the British government. Some of them were transported, some of them were put in prison with hard labor. So, they were treated in most ways much worse than the suffragettes were treated, even without the arson campaign and that kind of thing, right? So it's people they have like a very bad view of how men and women get treated. They just automatically assume that men are privileged in every single situation, right? So that's why I'm saying we need to fight against this kind of thing. There's so many things, because I could also raise the point that men can be raped. Like, not that if they could be raped, no, they literally can be raped as of now, right? And yet in so many countries there's no law against specific rape. Would it be accurate for a feminist to say if men could get raped, then men would get all the resources and women would get none? No, because men could be raped right now and there's not much help given to them. So I just found that funny as all.
Yeah, I think it's the best thing is to make society consider men's issues. That would be the best thing to do. And my issues or my question would be generally, how could we best go about this to make people more aware of the issues that are going on?
Yeah, and to be able to do that in a way that doesn't make us adversaries of each other. To get past all the hot takes and all the disparities and all of the historical injustices and say, you know what, you're right, things are bad. What should we do? In previous conversations on this forum, I said, well, here's what I do, and everyone seemed to think that was a bit of an overcorrection. To which I say, well, okay, give me something else, because continuously restating the problem and pointing, to one side or the other and its culture and saying this is your fault is kind of how we got into this mess in the first place. The time has come to sit down like adults, just like we're doing here, sit down like adults and say, here is my problem and here is, what it's doing to me from both sides, and say, something needs to be done. We need to be able to do better than this, or we should all just shut off the lights and go home because we're doomed. We have
It's
a chance. We have a chance to, do better than this. Asina, like you were saying, that there's a few glimmers of hope out there among younger people that things ought to be different. And my thing is to encourage that and to try to, silence or at least tone down.
Yeah.
The restatement that this is just the way things are and it all sucks, and nobody's happy. Well, fair enough. I'm not going to deny that, but at the same time, we are humans, and our hallmark of being human is that we're clever and adaptable and able to overcome not only our innate characteristics but also all of our history. It's time to get on that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. One thing I feel like is really important for us, because let's face it, right now we're pretty much viewed as a hate group among people. I think we need to, I don't know if there's a way that we could do this, but it's like, okay, not really gatekeep, but like we need to get like we need to detach our group from people who are trying to hijack our movement for their selfish ambition or for their selfish gain. Because what I've seen is that there are some people who genuinely think the MRA movement is about putting women in their place, or that kind of, or that, rubbish. I've seen people online, especially on Twitter, because Twitter is just the birthplace of all evil, honestly. But like I've seen many, like the MRM movement on this Discord and the MRM movement on Twitter is just worlds apart, right? So like
Yeah.
on Twitter, it's literally just that, they just genuinely want to be misogynistic, they just want to say, it's actually women who are the bad ones and that kind of thing, which is not what we're trying to do. And then for some reason, we just get an influx of these white supremacists, homophobes, like I don't know, like these alt-right people who want to, in quotes, reclaim masculinity because they think that, gay men and transgender women are a threat to masculinity and they view masculinity as this god or whatever, and the most of us are not here for that. We fight for the rights of gay men just as much as we fight for the rights of straight or bisexual men. We don't consider them inferior or bad or anything like that. And of course, white supremacy in a men's movement makes no sense, because if you're going to fight for one type of man, you can't fight for men if you only fight for one type of man. You can't fight for men if you only want to fight for white men, you know? And then it's mostly just viewed among people as this, like I said, backlash to feminism, So for example, okay, you might say that it is a backlash against of the more toxic aspects of feminism, or like this specific discrimination against men, which has become a result of some type of feminist legislature. That I don't mind. But what some people believe is that the MRM is all about, in quotes, getting women back in the kitchen or whatever, like that's what they think it is about, So I
I think
think
that's
in one
mostly the
sense,
mainstream media trying to subvert the narrative in favor of feminism.
exactly. So they're like these, I was listening to, I think her name was Catherine Spiller, or there was another feminist who was talking about the MRM, and then she was saying that essentially what the men's rights activists want is that, like, they're really angry because, like, in the 60s and the 70s, like, they wouldn't have to iron their own shirts because that was done for them by women, and women don't want to do that anymore, so now they're upset. Like, that's not what we want at all. I mean, like, that's not what we want, So, like, even the female MRAs, it's not that they want to go back to a traditional way of life where women were oppressed or men were oppressed or whatever. That's totally the opposite of what we want. So, I think where the problem lies is that when we reject theories of patriarchy and misogyny, many people think that we're saying that misogyny is okay, or that women being oppressed is okay. We don't consider that okay at all. But we have to do a kind of, I don't know how we're going to do it exactly, but we need to do a kind of reclaiming of our image, because
Yeah.
right now the image is just that, we're all a bunch of misogynists, meeting having a patriarchy Zoom call, discussing how we're going to oppress women, you know. So that's the view, and again, they bunch us with the incels and the MGTOWs, and I'm not talking about the MGTOWs who just want to be left alone without getting married. I'm talking about, like, the crazy misogynist ones, and these red pillars, the one who, again, I totally
Yeah.
dislike the red pill guys, because let's be honest, apart from them being misogynistic, they're pretty misandrous. Like, if you believe that 80% of men are just trash, then yeah, I mean, how much more sexist can you get? So we're not with them at all. Like, we have nothing to do with them, and yet we're bunched with them all the time. Like, people will literally say incels slash MRAs slash MGTOW, for example, when they're making a meme or a joke or something. You know, like people don't think that there's a difference between us and those other guys. You know, so yeah.
I think the best thing we can do is, create grassroots movements in outside of Discord and in Discord. Try to convince more people that men are also just people, and we have the same valid reasons to exist as anybody else. But and also be able to provide evidence-based counterpoints to feminism and the mainstream ideals, and then just keep convincing more people, and eventually we'll be able to start political movements, and then we'll get cultural change and societal change, hopefully. I would say. I don't know. I don't think we're gonna get any huge corporate backing, because we're basically we're saying we're for men, so we're not trying to say we're saving women from being victims, or we're not appealing to anything that they would want to sponsor. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. And I think if we find enough people, we'll be able to fund it, because, well, lots of people have pocket change, and lots of pocket change can become something.
Hey,
I'm
just going. Yeah, I'm just going to stop the stream in a second. So thank you everyone for turning up. I'm going to leave the voice chat on, so feel free to carry on. But thanks for everyone who's listening in on YouTube, and thanks for everyone turning up. I think it's been quite a good one. So good night, everyone, and we'll see you again at the usual time, probably next week, although it does depend on some new schedules, so it might be 5:30 again, but it will be on the same day. Good night then, and everyone else carry on.
See ya.